Hello everyone, my name is Ben Reeds. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm just going to be talking about how I rate different books and how I rate differently depending on the genre. I thought it would be an interesting topic because it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, like regarding how I would rate an academic book versus how I would rate like a Sarah J. Maas book, which obviously I can give them both 5 out of 5 for different reasons, or I could give them 1 out of 5 for different reasons. So I just wanted to kind of like talk about my different reasons for making different ratings for different genres and different levels of like reading. So I thought that would be an interesting topic. So I'll start with how I would rate academic books. So books I would read for school, or books that are just more in the academic genre and more intelligently focused. Not really intelligently focused, but like just they're a bit higher on the reading level and how I would rate them. So if I was reading a book, say like Shakespeare, something like that, I would have a different rating system than I would have for reading something like Sarah J. Maas or Mary Lou, and like those kinds of like fantasy, fictional, like just more escapism books. And I think academia can be escapism too, but I think I differentiate them when I'm reading them. So I'll give you an example. So when I'm reading a book for school, and in this example I'm going to use Moon with Crusted Snow, which I read for a third year reading class about science fiction and how it correlates to climate change, I take notes, and I take all my notes in color, and so I kind of pick apart the book as I'm reading it. So I'll look at the key characters, key themes, different things that I could look at, like how it's written, how well it's written, and just how I feel about the book in general, and then I can make my rating based on those things. It takes a lot more deep and ethical thought into how it was written, how I feel about the author. Those are things that I think about when I'm reading an academic book, rather than when I'm reading a book more for my enjoyment. So obviously when I'm reading one of my academic books, I'm taking lots of notes, I'm showing how I feel about the different things that are happening, and it means a lot to me. So this book I ended up giving a 4 out of 5 because I did have some issues with pacing, and those are things that I would pay more attention to, where I'm like reading it and I'm like, there's an issue with pacing here, there's a issue with how things are being written, I don't like how this character said this thing. I'm paying more attention to how people are interacting, how people are speaking, how people are behaving in these situations that they're put in. Like, I put a lot more emphasis on paying attention to the story than I would if I was reading something like, for example, a Sarah J. Maas book. Hi, Andy. So there's a lot more emphasis on how things are moving than there is when I'm reading a book that's just not like, I'm not gonna say it's a trashy novel, but I'm gonna say it's a lighter novel for me to enjoy. Like, I would analyze Gideon the Ninth, which is my favorite book of all time, the same way I would analyze Moon of the Crusted Snow, because it is a tough-ass book to read. But I feel the same way about it, and I take the time to understand it the same way I did with one of my academic books. The one I'm reading, something like Court of Mist and Fury or Throne of Glass, I'm taking more time to just be in the world and not really thinking about how I feel about how characters are saying things, how I feel about how the writing's moving. And just like, I pay less attention to those things when I'm reading a book that I more just want escapism for than a book that I'm really interested in paying attention to. So for example, when I was doing my film and book class this year, my third level one, I would take a film or a book and I would pick it apart specifically for the thing that we were studying. So one of the projects that we had was to take apart a movie called Beasts of the Southern Wilds and analyze the themes, and that's how I would decide my rating on it. I would pick apart the themes, how I felt about the characters, how I felt about the cinematography, just like the nitty-gritty details that I don't normally think about when I'm watching a horror movie, or when I'm watching a movie that doesn't require as much thought, or when I'm reading a book that doesn't require as much thought. It's just those kinds of things that I think about and that I like really look for while I'm doing something academic or when I'm doing something that has a lot of thought process to it. So for example, when I was analyzing Beasts of the Southern Wilds, I ended my review and my paper with, in short, Beasts of the Southern Wilds is a deeply intriguing film with masterful imagery that brings many moral questions to its viewers. The rights and beliefs of different cultures, such as the culture of the bathtub, are important to take into account when helping in a disaster. It is not right to assume that people are ill or savage because they live a lifestyle that they consider more freeing for them. All these points are made very clear through the perspective of Hush Puppy, a brave and curious girl who remains hilarious and wonderful to watch until the very end. So obviously I'm thinking more about what the filmmaker wanted me to see. I'm thinking more about what the author wanted me to see. I'm thinking more about what I should be seeing in this novel, this movie, this book, this show, than I would be if I were just reading a book about fantasy characters that I can just lightly read, that I could finish in a day, and that I don't have anything like to do a project on. So when I rate a book that I'm like really like, I have to be invested in it for either school or for my own pleasure, but it's just a deeply thoughtful book, I pick apart everything and then I decide my rating based on that. So for academic books, I take theme, character, writing, pacing, style, author, and many other things into account, where when I'm reading more of, I'll get into that when I start talking about more of the light reading side of things. I just take 3 things into account about how I feel about it, and it's how I write every single review that I make. So when I'm taking all those things that I need for an academic or a deeper thought book into account, it kind of changes how I rate things. So for example, I would rate something like by Shakespeare a 3 out of 5 based on how I feel about all those things, how I feel about the theme, how I feel about the characters, how I feel about the writing, how I feel about the flow, the style, all of those things that I take into account when I'm reading it. So it's something that I put a lot of thought into, and that really changes my rating towards the end. So I gave Gideon the Ninth a 5 out of 5 because it took me a lot of thought, a lot of processing. I really enjoyed the characters, I really enjoyed how well written they were, I really enjoyed the scenery, the world building, like all those things kind of culminate together to make my review for something I have to put a lot of thought into. So when it actually comes to writing about my rating and about my review for a more deeper novel or a movie, I take a lot more into account, and I write a paper rather than I would write a short blog review that I would for a lighter read. So when I'm writing a review for something like Macbeth or Moon of the Crusted Snow or Gideon the Ninth, I take a lot of things into account, and I'm like, okay, this is how I feel about this thing, but also all those themes and all these research things that I've seen around it are also influencing how I feel about it. So I'm gonna put this all into a culminated paper and put my rating in there somewhere. So for example, when I talked about Lady Macbeth, when I talked about Macbeth in general, I really focused on the fact in my review that Lady Macbeth was one of the most intriguing characters to me. And I talked about like why that was. And that's how I built a really good review based on that, because I could pull a theme that really meant something to me and just really like roll with it. And that's how I could write a good review on it, and that could go for both a bad or a good rating. So one of the things I talked about in my paper for Lady Macbeth was the lack of feminist qualities in Lady Macbeth and how she displayed very masculine traits. Like in one paragraph, I quoted, "Under my battlements come you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here and fill me from the crown to the toe top full. O direst cruelty, make thick my blood." And then I said, one of the most strange characteristics of Lady Macbeth is her overly masculine energy, which at the time was a very unpopular characteristic in women. Shakespeare's had other powerful female characters other than Lady Macbeth, such as Portia from The Merchant of Venice, who also had a strong masculine energy to her. So it is apparent that Shakespeare is not opposed to having women having something to say in his plays. Lady Macbeth, unlike Portia, was masculine in very violent ways. As she says above, she wishes to be a man so she can kill Duncan herself and her husband can become king. So I was talking about the oddity of how a man at the time had written a woman in such a way that she was powerful and she wanted to be masculine to display her power. And so I really dug into that theme of how I felt about Lady Macbeth, and I ended up giving Macbeth overall a 4.5 out of 5, I think it was. And that's how I dug into it for my review, but I also like really enjoyed everything about it in general. But how I review it is I more focus on essential theme. So again, going back to Moon of the Crusted Snow, when I wrote my my presentation for that book, because we ended up presenting rather than writing a full paper on it, I ended up writing that Jason Scott acts as a representation of the colonialists coming into native lands hundreds of years ago and terrorizing and converting the native community. Just as they were hundreds of years ago, the Anishinaabe people are forced to flee their home in search of a safe place to rebuild themselves. Moon of the Crusted Snow does not shy away from showing the damage of historical and modern colonialism of the native people. The ways of the Anishinaabe people are so changed and modernized to the Western world convenience, causing the members of the reservation who still hold on to their traditional values much grief. So I really focused on the grief of colonialism and how damaging it is to native communities when I was reading Moon of the Crusted Snow, because that was a really big theme, and I really dug into that. And I also really enjoyed the theme, and I enjoyed the characters, and I enjoyed the story, so I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5. But I wrote my review specifically tailoring to a theme. I'm just thinking through how this video is going so far, and I really hope all of this makes sense. So when I'm reading a fictional book that I'm just reading for pleasure or that doesn't take as much thought as the other books that I read, I rate them based on 3 things. So I rate them based on the characters, the world building, the writing style. And that's just kind of how So when I am reading a book for just pleasure or for a book that didn't take as much thought, I rate them based on 3 things. I rate them based on the characters, the story, and then the writing overall. So the writing would cover everything like the style, the world building, but I'm not putting as much thought into it. I'm just looking at it as, did I like the writing? Instead of like, did I like this aspect of the writing, or this aspect of the writing, or this aspect of the writing? So it's a lot simpler for me to look at a pleasure book and just be like, yeah, okay, this is how I feel about it, and I don't need an explanation for it. That's just how I feel. This is why I didn't like these characters, and that's it. So that's how I would rate a book that I'm just reading for pleasure. So for example, when I reviewed the book Pretty Girls by Karen Slaughter, I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 because I had some issues with some of the plot twists and just some of the stuff at the end. I just didn't really like it. And I didn't need to give a reason for that. I just didn't like it. But I basically said that I really like the characters. I give the characters a 5 out of 5, and like how I do my ratings is I kind of like every category I give a grade basically. And I do that for my academic reviews too, but I more write a paper about it and then see how I feel after writing the paper. But once I'm done reading, I pretty much have a review in mind for when I'm reading a book that I just read for fun. So for the characters, I put a 5 out of 5 for Pretty Girls, and I said Claire Scott started off as a weak character for me, but ended up as a character I was most rooting for. Throughout the entire book, you take a deep dive into the psyche of her complex grief and rage as she uncovers the truth about her husband. So I really I was just talking about the fact that I enjoyed her character, that I wasn't looking too deep into why this character existed, why this character was here, and what themes connected to her to the overall story. I'm not really thinking about those things. I'm thinking about how I feel about this thing rather than how well was this thing done? How did this connect to the theme? Like these kinds of things that I think about when I'm reading a book that I'm just reading for pleasure, that I'm not looking too deep into, that I just want to enjoy. So when I'm reading a book that's like Sarah J. Maas or Holly Black, I'm not looking too deep into the story or the writing or how good it is. I'm just looking for my enjoyment on it. And I really like Sarah J. Maas books. I really, really enjoy them. So I'm gonna give them a good rating based on how much I enjoy the characters and based on how much I enjoy the story, rather than based on how well it's done. And that's kind of how I decide what those ratings are going to be when I'm reading a book that I'm literally just reading for fun. Like there's no deep dive into it. Like I'm not looking at The Cruel Prince the same way I look at I'm Thinking of Ending Things, or Gideon the Ninth, or like any of those books that have a deeper level to them that you have to be like, wow, I need to keep thinking, I need to keep thinking, and I need to figure this out. I'm just looking at that book and I'm like taking it at face value and I'm like, this is how I feel about it, and that's it. That's just how I feel about it. And so when I'm doing these two different reviews for how I don't actually think about it when I'm doing a review for a book that takes a lot more thought and when I'm doing a review for a book that takes a lot less thought, I don't really think about the difference. I just know when I'm reading a book for school or for academic purposes or for reading a book that's like just more challenging, I take apart the book a lot more subconsciously. And then when I'm reading a book like Sarah J. Maas's books, I'm just like, yeah, I liked it. Like, that's how I feel. I really, really liked it. I connected with the characters. That's all I care about mostly when I'm writing a book that doesn't have to have any like academic value to me. I'm just like, I connected with the characters. That's usually the main thing for me, is if I connected to the characters. But I'll just be like, I connected with the characters, I enjoyed the story, I had fun. 5 out of 5. That's how I take those books. But when I'm taking academic books, I'm just like, here's all this shit. This is how I feel about each and every section of this shit. Good job, bad job. Like, that's kind of just how I see it. So I hope this video made sense at all, because this was basically me rambling and hyperfixating on books and being extremely excited about how I rate things for like 10 minutes. But I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it makes sense, because I had a couple people asking me about like why I would rate a Sarah J. Maas book a 5 out of 5 and then like something like Shakespeare like a 3 out of 5, and they're like, those aren't comparable. And I'm like, no, they're not comparable. That's why I rate them very differently. Like, they have two completely different systems of rating for me. So how I rate and review different books is very different based on the book I'm reading it for and what purpose I'm reading it for. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it makes sense. I hope it helps you understand how I feel about books and maybe how you feel about books that you didn't even know. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you all next week. I have a nice little birthday vlog next week because June 17th is my birthday and I'm going to a nice cabin for the weekend. So you guys will get to come along with me on that. I might do a video earlier in the week, just where I'm spending the weekend away, so I won't have a video done until next Monday. So I might do another video next week. I'm not sure what it'll be about. But yeah, so I can't wait to see you guys then. Bye.